So today we're going to continue our discussion of corporate strategy, kind of addressing exactly where we compete versus, which is different than business strategy, which is how do we compete with which competitive advantage, and functional strategies, which ask deploying which resources and competencies. So as our continuation of corporate strategy, we're going to talk about strategic maneuvers. Okay. We're going to look at mergers and acquisitions, alliances, vertical integration and disintegration. We'll look at diversification and divestment and international strategies. So before we get into all the meat and potatoes of mergers and acquisitions, let's talk a little bit about what is a merger. A merger can be defined as a strategy through which two firms agree to integrate their operations on a relatively co-equal basis. So it's a partnership of equals. Think of it of almost like a marriage. Then you have the acquisition. Make sure you can see. The acquisition is a strategy through which one firm buys a controlling or a 100% interest in another firm with the intention of making the acquired firm a subsidiary business within its portfolio. So think of a very large corporation buying a much smaller firm, and that much smaller firm becomes a strategic business unit of the much larger corporation. And then we have the takeover. The takeover is a special type of acquisition strategy where the target firm does not solicit the acquiring firm's bid. Think of, for example, when a rival firm buys up all the shares of a stock, shares of a certain company in the open stock market. So we have to ask ourselves, which is better, internal or external growth? And part of that depends on industry characteristics. In a mature industry, internal growth is generally not seen as advisable because it contributes to an increase in installed capacity and therefore lower profit levels. So it doesn't make sense to invest within the firm itself because then you have more capacity and you lose profit. But when entry barriers are very high, an acquisition is sometimes the only way to obtain the necessary resources and capabilities required to operate successfully in a certain industry. So think about if you have something with a very high a very high entry barrier. Think of, I don't know, a firm that has certain geographical or material assets like a special space of land that's unique, or maybe drilling or mineral rights, then you'd have to acquire them in order to get that. But it could also be something like knowledge or know-how or a brand. So how about when Disney acquired Lucas Brands, the Star Wars franchise? There wasn't a real way for Disney to grow a Star Wars brand because it already existed. So they bought Star Wars. There wasn't a way for them to grow their own real comic series, so they bought Marvel. Okay. So that's an example of high entry barriers. It's very hard to replicate the Disney or the Marvel trademarks. That'd be a high entry barrier, which is kind of similar to a high entry barrier with a particular piece of land, oil, mineral rights, whatever. Okay. Now, we can also look at target activities. The more distant the target activities are from a company's core competencies, the more external growth is appropriate, or the more appropriate it is to acquire a different firm, because their competencies and abilities are so different from your own, it would take a long time for you to grow those competencies in-house. Then there are certain tactical considerations. There's a time to market. It takes a long time to grow a product or a capacity. It's usually faster to just go out in the marketplace and buy a competitor. Of course, sometimes you just want to eliminate a competitor, so you buy them. And there may be a lot of potential target companies that can be bought, so why not? It's practical. So let's talk a little bit about merger and acquisition motivations. We've got a horizontal merger and acquisition. Horizontal merger and acquisition means that you have acquired a competitor. And the goal of acquiring a competitor is to generate economies of scale and reinforce your market power, and also to eliminate a competitor. But then you've also got vertical mergers and acquisitions. So a vertical merger and acquisition is the acquisition of value chain upstream or downstream actors. Meaning that those other actors can give you preferred access to a raw material, key components, or distribution channels. They can improve the products or services that you offer, and they can increase your margins. So in other words, you are buying a different step in the production process, not necessarily buying an entire competitor. Okay? They are somebody that can make tires better than you can. They can make doors better than you can. They can. They have better IT or better telemarketing or something like that. So that's why you would buy them, to get those processes integrated within your own firm. Okay. And horizontal and vertical, of course, you can think about with the Porterian versus the resource-based view. Horizontal M&A really looks at the Porterian view of strategy in that you are buying the competition, because strategy is a zero-sum game, so by buying the competition you necessarily get bigger and take away their wealth. Whereas the vertical merger and acquisition says, you know what, they have certain processes, materials, or capabilities that we want, and by acquiring them we can increase the activities that we're already conducting within the firm. And of course there's other kinds of mergers and acquisitions out there. There's things like economies of scope. That's where you're buying a brand, a particular managerial style, or particular employees, etc. You want to enter a new and attractive sector, or you are anticipating some sort of an industry substitution. Now, of course, there are risks to engaging in mergers and acquisitions, and these can be significant. In fact, 50% of mergers and acquisitions are seen to destroy value for the firm that is making the acquisition. Now, for the firm being bought, there's usually some degree of benefit. There's some degree of value generation. Some of the ailments include organizational dysfunction. So, you know, people within the acquiring firm or acquired firm, you know, have to face things like paralysis, fear, resentment of their new partners. There can be feuds between top management, erosion of valuable intangible assets such as a company culture, their identity, their unique capabilities, and of course there's just no exploitation of synergies periodically. So there are definite risks to engaging in mergers and acquisitions. Great. So in our next video, we're going to talk about alliances. Looking forward to seeing you then.